There is a lot to be said this week. Welcome to those of you on YouTube. This is I'm Avi Grossman. Thank you for tuning in once again. This week, Parashath Sara. It's the year 5780. And the news today, just so that we can date this video, is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has just been indicted by his own Attorney General. And yesterday they were basically saying that we're going to have a third round of elections to resolve the formation of a new government, which has, of course, not happened now. You see very clearly, it's times like these where we see that man plans, God laughs. God is the one who's guiding history, and he's the one who's making decisions. It seems that Netanyahu is just really holding on. He's been okay. He's been a historical figure, for better or for worse. I'm not going to comment on him, give my opinion. But he's been tenaciously holding on to power all this time, and they just can't seem to get rid of him. They can't. He doesn't, even when he doesn't win an election, he doesn't stay as prime minister, or he doesn't get to officially renew it, but he's still holding on to power. I believe there should be a biblical parallel to this. Somehow, this reminds me of something from, let's say, the Book of Kings or something from the Maccabean era, but I can't put my foot on it, mostly because in the olden days, they didn't have elections. And when they wanted to be rid of a ruler, usually the only option was regicide, which is terrible. In the olden days, even before that, when the Jewish people were ruled by judges, not even ruled, when they were shepherded by judges and prophets, it was quite much easier. They retired. They took, let's say, the Washingtonian precedent. They faded into the sunset. For example, like Joshua and Gideon, people like that. They even declined. They were against the idea of becoming monarchical. And now we've advanced in our history. Now we have prime ministers who are basically monarchs. There's no way to get rid of them. And the discussion is perhaps they even should be immune to prosecution, like the ancient Israelite monarchs and the way monarchs today in certain countries. God willing, we'll have more to say about this next week, but this week is not the time. Parashath Hayei Sara is, of course, the parasha wherein we read about the passing of Sara and the finding of Rebecca, the second matriarch, who was to marry Yitzchak Avinu and continue the line. I find it's very important to stress, although we have an unbroken chain from Abraham to Jacob. Abraham lived for 75 years with his son Isaac, and Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born, meaning that for the next 15 years, Jacob lived with Abraham. Jacob knew Abraham, as did Esau. Jacob knew his uncle Ishmael. Jacob grew up with Isaac. They lived, they were contemporaneous for 120 years. They worked together and lived together and preached God's word together. But the matriarchs did not really overlap at all. Sarah passed away when Isaac was 37 years old, and Rebecca entered the picture shortly thereafter. Isaac married her at the age of 40. I don't know how much time, it's very unclear how much time between when she was brought back to Canaan and when the wedding was actually held, but still, you see that there's a few years gap between Sarah and Rebecca. And according to the tradition, the way we understand the verses, Jacob returned to his parents' house. He had been away for quite a few decades, and he returned from Aram. According to one rabbinic chronology, the major one, he was gone for almost 30 years and more. There's 14 years are unaccounted for in his life. He was gone for, let's say, about 21 years or so from his parents, but it seems to be more like 31 years, 35 years. So they say he was gone. He was in the academy of Shem and Aver, whatever that means. It wasn't a traditional, let's say, midrash like you see behind me with shelves of Talmud and Mishnah. But he was away somewhere, and he came back with his wives, two of whom were considered our matriarchs, Rachel and Leah. And apparently, Rebecca was already passed away by that point. And it's even alluded to, they say, in a verse where it says that Rebecca's nurse passed away while Jacob was on his way home. And that's an illusion. They didn't want to mention the fact that Rebecca had died in sort of unfortunate circumstances away from her beloved son and her other son, Esau, who could not attend her funeral. So the matriarchs are basically 3 generations worth, and they never met each other. And that's a little bit of a sad footnote in our history. Not even a footnote, that perhaps they're saying too that the tradition of the matriarchs was broken up. However, and that's why I believe that there's an emphasis placed on this in the Midrash that Rashi brings, that when Rebecca was brought to Sarah's tent, grammatically it means she was brought to the tent of his mother Sarah. That means Ohel Saraimo. Ohel Saraimo would be one full construct of the tent of his mother Sarah, and that's what it says Ola. But it's very awkward the way it works out. So the Medrash says it means he brought her to the tent, and she was just like Sarah. Why do they have to emphasize that? They don't say that, for example, Isaac was just like Abraham, or Jacob was just like Isaac. They have to emphasize this because one could say, how did Rebecca know what to do as a proper Hebrew matriarch? The answer is that she had it. She didn't need that tradition necessarily. The tradition of the mothers in the house is different than that of, let's say, the fathers and the Rabbanim. One has to learn directly from his father and from his teacher of Torah. That's considered the chain of tradition. Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, Misareli Yeshua. Yeshua received from Moshe, and we say Elijah received from Ahijah, who received from King David, who received from Samuel. There's traditions. Who learned from who? The mother's tradition is different. Al titosh Torati Mecha. The tradition we have from the mothers is something that you don't get in yeshiva. It's not something that is a continuous chain, yet it is even more primordial than that. What you learn from your mother is something you can't get in yeshiva. What you learn from your mother is something that's born, that's innate, something that's almost instinct. Or as my father liked to say, it's in the mother's milk. Almost literally. Chazal take that expression almost literally when they say that Moses did not want to nurse from an Egyptian woman, a native Egyptian woman. There's something different about that, something that transcends an actual chain. So Rebecca was the continuation of Sarah without even having met her. That's how natural it was. So too, Rachel and Leah never met Rebecca. As a matter of fact, Rachel even died before Jacob finished his trek home. So even if we assume that Rebecca might have been alive, and the verse is not explicit because she was still alive, Rachel never met Rebecca, who never met Sarah, but still we consider that the tradition of the matriarchs. We're now going to turn back to something we were discussing last time, continuing with the Hebrew calendar. We're talking about how the ancients perceived the universe. And by universe, I mean the immediate surroundings of planet Earth in this universe, because the universe is much more vast than many of us throughout history have ever imagined. They used to think the universe was Earth-centered. By universe, what they saw was the Earth on which we stand, and the sun, the moon, the visible planets, which turn out to be our neighbors, and the whole rest of the sky. And that's it. That's the universe. And the Earth sits in the middle thereof. And you can see, do a basic Google search. I wish I could show this on the screen. I'm not quite sure how to do it. Is there a screen share option here? But I'd show you. You look up ancient Jewish or ancient Hebrew cosmology. You'll find the convenient illustration. Slifkin has one also of how the ancients perceived of the world. And basically, the entire known world was flat. It was one continent or continents that were roughly close to each other, surrounded by vast oceans. And underneath the Earth was the nether regions, and it went on basically for a certain amount of time, a certain point, until it's also just the great deep beneath. And this Earth, surrounded by limitless oceans, was encased by a dome, what they call the rakia. The heavens was basically a solid dome of a material that no one experienced. No one could have known what it was really made out of. And the sun, during the day, makes a trek on the inside of this dome, and that's why it's hot during the day. The sun goes across the sky. It's basically within this dome, and when it sets below the horizon, it doesn't continue underneath us, so to speak, even though technically speaking, visually, that's where it goes. It goes to the other side of the Earth. But even now we know we're actually orbiting the sun, and the Earth is spinning on its axis, and we're just putting the sun relative to ourselves below us. They believe that the sun actually went laterally, went within, burrowed through the thickness of the firmament, that's this dome, and then made a return trip on the other side of the dome, which obscured its light, and that's why it's dark at night. And this was actually something that already in ancient times, by the second century, great Hebrew sages, Jewish sages, none other than Rabbi Yehuda Nasi himself, believed that this was already a mistaken cosmology. This is not the way it actually is in real life. He was basically one of the first people to point out that with that which is described in the first chapter of Genesis is not a literal physical history of creation. It cannot be. And that was never a heretical position. Maimonides and others also held that one. So it's in the Mishnah already. But there were still Jewish sages who clung to this ancient cosmology, which not only wasn't not the something that was strictly Jewish or Hebrew, it was also something that the Persians and Babylonians had in other ancient cultures because that's what it appears. But Greek-trained natural philosophers, I wouldn't call them scientists, they didn't use the scientific method, but Greek-trained wise men, Ptolemean wise men in Alexandria and other places, had already realized that the Earth is a sphere, and that basically, as best as we can describe it, the sun goes below the Earth during the night and doesn't burrow through the firmament. And there's actually a good thing. I'll mention Sufkin again because he actually has a good article about this, explaining how Rabbeinu Tam, none other than Rabbeinu Tam, believed that no, the ancient cosmology had to be correct, and that is why he had such a radically different approach to the Zmanim than other Rishonim and the Gonim, and his position, as we'll see, actually dominated Jewish halachic practice and thought for almost 1,000 years because of that. But that is how they used to imagine it. And that's part of our perceptions. We'll go on to the next part of the curriculum. And of course, if there are any questions, don't forget to forward them. That is how they used to imagine it. Now, we're going to talk about Zmanim now. Halachic times. In the olden days, they used to use sundials. A sundial basically can only work when the sun is shining. A sundial does not work at night. A sundial also, unfortunately, cannot really work when it's cloudy. And that was that's probably one of the bigger motivations that human beings had to find other technologies that would help them tell time during the day. The concept of hours, dividing up, let's say, the night into hours, is something that we do not find in the halakha. The halakha just talks about dividing up the night into watches, basically thirds. That you could do, especially if the moon is out, you can roughly divide the night into thirds. Those are called watches. There was an honor guard in the temple, which would have take shifts every third of the night. And the middle of this second watch was around midnight. I like to stress, and I think this is something that's almost scandalous that is not pointed out. The sages did describe, this is in the first Mishnah in the entire Talmud, that midnight has halachic consequences. But when they said midnight, they did not mean an exact minute or an exact second or milliseconds like we have in our common calendars. No one could tell such a thing. The sages never held us to such an exacting standard. Midnight means that it's roughly. And why would they allow it to be roughly? Why is it just an estimate? Because it's always used as a rabbinic enactment to prevent people from waiting for the last minute to fulfill the obligations they have to do at night. The Jewish night, the halachic night, ends with the crack of dawn, alot hashachar, when the first lights become visible in the eastern horizon. That's we're also going to describe when exactly that is. But this was something that people could see. The night, the sky is quite dark, but if a person's looking out to the east, he'll eventually see that it's not as dark as it used to be. That's the break of dawn. That's when the dawn breaks, and that's when the day officially starts according to halacha. There's some mitzvot that a person has to accomplish, fulfill by the crack of dawn. For example, the nightly recitation of Kriyat Shema. So Rabbi Gamliel was telling his children that, yes, you have until dawn to say Shema, but the sages didn't want you to perhaps wait until dawn because you'll wait, and then, oops, it's already dawn now, it's too late, you missed the mitzvah. So they say you have to do it by midnight. Or another commandment, one of the few biblical commandments that have to be done at night, is the consumption of the Korban Pesach. See our other YouTube videos about that also. The Korban Pesach, you have all night long until the crack of dawn to eat it. And the sages didn't want anybody to wait until the crack of dawn to eat the Korban Pesach. So they said, you have to eat it by midnight. It doesn't mean there was an exact moment where people are looking at their watches nowadays. Oh man, we have 5 minutes left. If you have 5 minutes left to eat Korban Pesach, it means you still have quite a lot of time left. They would have even said a person made sure to, whatever reason, extenuating circumstances, he had to be in the delivery room the night of Passover. And he gets back to the Seder 10 o'clock at night. It's only beginning then. Or someone who was the doctor who was on call. There's always emergency responders and people like that who have to change their Passover schedule. They're safe. Even if they finish, even I would say half an hour after what we now know as midnight, the sages would say they're fine because they were trying their best and they finished before midnight. And we'll see also that with regards to other halachot, I've tried to point this out to some people, that's not an exact time. It never was an exact time. And to say, even according to Kabbalah, there's people who believe it's best to wake up, so to speak, at Chatzot, at midnight, and begin their Torah study and prepare already for the morning prayers. They don't really mean the stroke of midnight according to our clocks. They mean very, very early in the morning. Even 3 hours before sunrise, even during the summer, that's still halachic midnight. It means well before dawn, hours before dawn. So too, I was going to point out for some things that you wait until midnight if you're waiting at the beginning of the night. If it's already 4 hours after the sun went down in the summer, the sages would consider that midnight. They wouldn't have no way of telling, it's already, you need still to wait 7 hours and 5 minutes after sundown for it to be midnight. If it's already 5 hours after the sun went down, that's midnight enough. The Torah wasn't given to the ministering angels, and we can't hold ourselves to such exacting standards. How does it work? They used to use sundials, and ancient man already realized millennia ago that when it comes to keeping time, keeping track of things, it's best to use numbers that are highly divisible, that have a lot of factors. So numbers that occur often are 360 or 3,600, 10,080. 10,080 is 3 times 360. Numbers that are divisible by 12 and 10, 8s, 4s, sometimes even 7s. This is very important because we need to be able to divide up time. So we have this, as you may or may not know, the metric system is highly scientific. Everything is in multiples of 10. And you have hundreds, powers of 10, decimals, but there's something that doesn't follow that. The metric unit for time is the second, and there's 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes an hour for a total of 3,600 seconds in an hour. That's a little bit awkward there. Yeah, but that's how it goes because we need to be able to play with these numbers. And there's 24 hours in a day. That's also something that decided to divide the day into 12 hours. And they found that on average, and this is basically true, on average, over the course of a year, the nighttime, as the time when the sun is below the horizon, after it sets and before it rises, is basically equal to that of the daytime, the time where the sun is above the horizon. On any given day, it might be lopsided. It's only on the equinoxes where it's 12 hours and 12 hours, but whatever we lack in the summer, we make up for in the winter, and vice versa. That is, the longest day is, let's say here in Israel, 14 hours of daylight. It means the longest night in December will be 14 hours of no sunlight. And over the course of the year, it evens out. And of course, on the equator, every day is 12 hours and 12 hours. Or on the poles, one day is basically half a year long, and the nighttime is half a year long. But it still works out. Everywhere on the earth shares this equality. They used to use sundials. They divide the day into 12, and they consider each of those a halachic hour. They didn't say that every objective hour for the halacha is 60 minutes, although they did know of such a thing. There's already mentioned by Maimonides, and he received this already from thousands of years before him that the average hour is 60 minutes long, but the seasonal hours actually drift. But they also have an average length of 60 minutes. It's just that most of the time they're more or less, but they still even out. Halachic hour meant look at the sundial and see what time it indicates. I wish I could have a sundial here. I can't show you how to use it, but a sundial is actually quite good. A sundial always indicates every day when chatzot is, when is midday. Any place you build a sundial, use it. It's the first thing you could find. Midday is always there. The only difference between midday every day of the year is the length of the shadow. On the longest day of the year, the sundial points to 12, the middle of the sundial, but the shadow is really short. And on the longest day of the year, the shadow is really long. And you could build a nice sundial. They even teach Boy Scouts how to do this. Your sundial's angle and the length of the shadow can actually indicate roughly what day of the year it is, depending on how precise you build your sundial. I could show you how to do this. It's actually quite simple. All it takes is a year to see all the different combinations, and you could even do this one at home. But that's the way they used to do it, and that's the way our calendars are reflected now. You don't even need a sundial anymore. As long as you know when sunrises and sunset are, you just divide the day into 12, and you could find, let's say, nowadays here in Israel, the days are basically come out to about 50 minutes per hour. If you know sunrise is, let's say, at 6, so the second hour begins at 6:50, and the third hour begins at 7:40, and so forth until sunset. And that's how we do halachic times. That's how, at least the way they used to do halachic times, that's the way the Vilna Gaon recommends doing halachic times. But next week, we're going to talk about the Magen Avraham and his major revolution in this regard. Don't forget, like, share, and subscribe. Send in your questions, comments, criticisms, whatever it may be. And we'll see you next time.